Okay, we're now going to move into the lecture for week 3. The topic that we're going to be talking about is voting. Um, Constitutionally, the original body of the Constitution said very little about voting. But we'll get into that and we'll talk about some of the developments that have gone along since the beginning of the country and where we stand now. And we'll end up by talking about some of the issues that are being brought up and are probably going to arise in the current election. Now, um, voting is, on one level, seemingly a simple process. You show up somewhere, you cast your vote, you help participate in determining who is going to represent you in government and to be part of the head of the executive branch in the country and in your state for the next period of time. And it would seem simple. But the reality is, it is a complicated thing, full of contention. And particularly as we move into the election of 2020, besides the normal political wrangling back and forth between the major parties, there's all kinds of craziness already going on concerning voting and whether it'll be fair, whether it'll be just, whether it'll be correct, how it will be counted, who's going to do the counting. There's just seems to be chaos rolling into reality as we're coming down the stretch here and having the voting for presidential and congressional offices in the next few weeks. One of the big issues that has arisen, and if you follow the news at all, you probably have heard of it, is that many Democrats and many state board of canvassers and secretary of states are calling for total mail-in voting to find a way around having people to stand in lines and be in crowded voting places on the day of the election. They say largely in response to COVID-19 and the virus, and they don't want to have voting lines and voting places to be means by which the virus is spread. On the other hand, you have the Republicans, and particularly the president, saying that mail-in voting, particularly the way that's being planned by the various state officials at this point, will just be a doorway to fraud and all kinds of other craziness, such as how do we know when all the votes have come in? How do we know when we have a final count? And I'm sure as we get close to Election Day, these arguments are just going to heat up further and further, and you're going to hear more and more about this. To make matters even worse, in the last 20 years, 2 presidential elections have come about where the popular vote, the number of votes cast by Americans, went to the person who did not win the votes in the electoral college. And of course, under our present constitutional system, the person who wins the electoral college votes, who gets a majority of 270 or more, becomes the president, regardless of how many popular votes they had. This happened in the year 2000, with George Bush running against Al Gore. And in that case, they were almost 3 million votes difference in terms of Gore getting more than Bush. And again, in 2016, between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, there was a difference of almost 3 million in the popular vote, which came out in favor of Hillary Clinton. However, Donald Trump obtained 307 of the electoral votes as opposed to Clinton's 266. And again, under our present system, that meant that Donald Trump became the president, even though Hillary had clearly obtained a majority of the popular vote. We will discuss this at length when we get into the section about the Electoral College, how it works, what it means. One of the things that I find incredible at this point in my life is that the vast majority of Americans have almost no understanding of how the Electoral College works, why it was created, what it is supposed to accomplish. And as a result, there is great confusion, as it was in 2016. If any of you were watching that night as the votes were coming in, a number of the networks had given the election to Hillary Clinton because the popular vote certainly indicated that. And by the end of the night, it turned out, in looking at things on a state-by-state basis, which is how the electoral votes are counted, Trump was the absolute winner, and not by a mere one vote, which is what happened with Bush versus Gore. Bush obtained just the 270 votes in the Electoral College needed to win. But we'll get into that a little bit later in this discussion. The Constitution, the main body of it, as I said a minute ago, says very little about voting. Um, Remember, the 13 colonies were free from England, had been for a number of years. They're basically operating as little independent countries. They had their own voting systems that had evolved during colonial times, even though England ruled the colonies. In terms of their local elections, they voted in most places, and they had popular elections for to determine who would hold offices such as mayor or city council person or county sheriff. They had popular votes even for the governors in several of the colonies, and certainly they all had, by the time the revolution came along, all of the colonies had legislatures that created laws for their internal needs, and those were by and large chosen by popular vote. So there already was an electioneering system, a voting system in place that had been in place for well over 100 years in most of the colonies at the point when the Constitution was being written. Again, if you think of the reality of life in those times, there was no mass communications. There was no easy and quick travel between the various colonies. When Washington was elected the first president, it took him 6 weeks to travel on land from his estate at Mount Vernon, south of Washington, D.C. today, up to New York, where the first capital was. So there was really no ability, no technical ability, no mechanism by which they could create a federal election system that would work exclusively just to determine who would become president, who would become congressmen, senators, and representatives. So the Constitution basically defaulted. They punted to the state governments. And in Article 1, which sets up Congress, it says that anyone who is an elector, which is the old word for voter, and is allowed to vote for the largest assembly office, which would normally be the House of Representatives in each state. So whoever was qualified to vote for a representative in the House of Representatives in their state, they de facto automatically were allowed to vote in federal elections. So right from the get-go, the Constitution is basically leaving it up to the states to determine who can vote for the federal elections, for offices of Congress. With the Senate, it was not an issue, because initially, as the Constitution was written, each state legislature picked their 2 senators, nominated them, and sent them to Washington. There was no popular vote involved whatsoever. If a senator died or had to resign midterm, the governors of the states were allowed to appoint an interim senator until the next period came when the legislature could vote for somebody to become the senator. So there was no popular voting at all for senators. In terms of voting for president, again, they had set up this thing called the Electoral College, whereby each state was allowed to have as many votes as they had representatives in Congress. And by representatives here, I mean both members of the House of Representatives and senators. So in Rhode Island, traditionally we have for the longest time had 2 representatives in the House, and we have had 2 senators. So we would have 4 electoral votes when it came time to vote for president. Needless to say, the larger states with the larger populations would be able to have far more people voting in the Electoral College than the smaller states, but there's a certain disproportionality because Rhode Island, with its not quite 1 million people, has 2 Senate votes, while California, with 37 million some people, only has 2 Senate votes. So, and this is one of the reasons why the Electoral College becomes dicey, and why somebody who possibly has not gotten the majority of the popular votes can still end up winning the situation. It was only in 1916 they amended the Constitution to allow direct representation and direct election of senators. But for the first well over 100 years of the country, the senators were picked by the state legislatures. Now, one of the things that we need to address here, too, is that at the time of the adoption of the Constitution, the people who qualified to be electors in most states were males over the age of 21. In many states, they had to be property owners, and by property we meant owners of real estate of some type. They had to be freemen. They could not be slaves. They could not be indentured servants. If anyone had ever been convicted of a felony, they were no longer allowed to vote. They lost the franchise, which is another fancy word for the right to vote. And in many states, even people who had formerly been slaves or formerly had been indentured servants did not acquire the right to vote. So the actual number of people in the population who could vote was very, very small compared to what it is today. And gradually, over the last 240 years, there's been an ever-increasing movement to allow more and more people, a greater part of the population, to engage in voting and to be considered citizens who have the right to vote. The one thing Congress was allowed to do under the Constitution was to establish when these elections would take place. And now the Constitution is very clear that there shall be elections for Congress, for the House of Representatives every 2 years. Senators would serve for 6 years. Presidents would serve for 4. Congress took care of this with a very simple statute, United States Code Section 7. It says that the election will always be held on even-numbered years on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So if Tuesday happens to be the 1st of November, then that is not an election day. It will go over to the 8th of November. But in all other years, it would be probably the first Tuesday in November coming after the first Monday. The Electoral College is an interesting but problematic reality. One of the things that went on among the people who wrote the Constitution and the people who were generally in political power at the end of the Revolution was that they tended to be from the upper classes. They tended to be merchants and shipping owners and plantation owners, fairly well-to-do people. They tended to be more educated people, and they were greatly afraid of the mob. And by the mob, they meant the regular people, the regular working people who held most of the positions in society, constituted the majority of society, but they were greatly afraid that in any type of government where there was participation by the population, where people had the right to vote, that if you allowed the mob to become powerful and to take over, that eventually it would lead to dictatorship. It would lead to the type of situation that they were trying to get out of by getting out of the British Empire. And they did not have bad reason to believe this. Many of them were educated in the classics. They knew the history of Greece. They knew the history of Rome. They knew the history of the Middle Ages, and they saw one by one as different democracies or republics would arise, either in the Greek city-states or in the Roman Empire or in the Italian city-states during the Renaissance, in the early modern period, that one by one all of these systems failed as the mob took control and eventually led to despotism, either because there was such chaos that nobody could manage to run the systems that make society work, and a dictator had to take over to straighten things out, or because by being promised bread and circuses, as in the case of the Romans, they eventually were happy to vote for any dictator and to allow an emperor to come in and rule over them, so long as they continued to get what they perceived as the benefits due to them from the government. Having been educated in these ancient systems, partly basing the system they were creating on some of these ancient systems, they were acutely aware that they did not want to give the mob free rein in the new government, even though they wanted to give as many people as possible, under their idea of that, some participation. So that is why the only branch of the federal government that was initially directly elected was the House of Representatives. And the idea was that the representatives were to be apportioned out where every so many 100,000 people had their own representative, and that therefore this was the person who was supposedly closest to the people. They would be elected by the people. However, all the rest of the government, the president, the Senate, the judiciary, would not be created, would not be positioned or peopled by way of voting. That there would be other systems in place to hopefully prevent the mob from becoming dictatorial and from becoming all powerful within the system. The Electoral College, of course, comes directly out of this idea that we cannot allow the people to directly pick the president. We have to somehow have control on that to make sure that they don't vote in a dictator. Now, the other reality is the states were their own little independent countries at the point when the Constitution was written. They certainly did not want to give up this power. They did not want to give up their authority. They did not want to give up control to some new government that could become dictatorial and undemocratic and usurp the authority that they had just fought very long and hard and expensively to get back from the British Empire and the British Crown. So part of the reason for the Electoral College is the small states like Rhode Island and Delaware realized very quickly that if the president was picked only by the popular vote, because they were so small and had so few people, they would come to have no power, no say, and basically be meaningless as concerned the outcome of the federal election. In those days, the most populous states were Pennsylvania, then New York and Virginia, and those states alone, but in terms of popular vote, they could pick the president. Somebody didn't need another popular vote from any other state to become president. And the small states, again, did not want to easily give up their self-control, their self-rule, their power, so they wanted some kind of break on the system that would still allow them some importance and some say into who would become president. And as a result of that, the Electoral College system was set up whereby basically the voting is done state by state, not across the nation as a whole. And this can create situations where, in the case of 2000, where Bush versus Gore came down to Bush won by one vote, had Rhode Island changed its votes in one direction or the other, they could have controlled who would become president. They would have say. Many people today talk about abolishing the Electoral College, and there have been a number of movements to try to do that, but none of them ever seem to gain enough steam to get it through. If we stay true to our traditions, we would have to amend the Constitution to abolish the Electoral College, and that requires a supermajority of the Senate and the House to approve an amendment, the President to approve an amendment, and then it requires 60%, 67%, two-thirds of the states to approve the amendment. This rarely happens. It rarely happens quickly, and on an issue as contentious as it has become in terms of choosing a president, this little likelihood that that's going to happen through this process anywhere in the near future. Now, again, in our time, many of the smaller states even now are saying they don't want to abolish the Electoral College because it would mean that they would have no say. If the Electoral College were gone, the states of California, Florida, and New York would basically control presidential elections today, and there would be no reason for a presidential candidate to ever visit, campaign, worry about the needs of the smaller states because they would basically be irrelevant to how the winner would be determined in a popular election. So it's not as if the Electoral College is totally arcane and totally out of date. There are still some arguments to be made as to its validity. I suspect, however, as time goes on, if we keep having more elections where the popular vote comes out one way, the Electoral College vote comes out another way, particularly if this gap begins to grow in that people begin to win the popular vote by bigger and bigger and bigger numbers and then still lose electorally, that there will be continuing pressure to do something about this, to change it, and to move the system to an entirely popular vote type system. Um, how can it be that someone like Hillary Clinton can win the popular vote by 3 million votes and still manage to lose the electoral college? And this is a part of the whole system that I find that the vast majority of Americans, even very well educated Americans, doctors and lawyers and engineers and scientists that I've spoken, financial wizards that I've spoken to, don't understand how this works. The reality is that in most of the states, you take all electoral votes as long as you get a majority, as long as you get 51% of those votes, or in many states, it's not even a majority, it's a plurality, as long as you come out with the most votes. It may not even be 51% of the votes, but if you are the leading vote getter, you get all the electoral votes from that state. At this point in time, I believe it is only Maine, with its 4 electoral votes, will split them based as closely as they can on the percentages of who won and who got what number of votes in the popular vote in Maine. But in every other state, as long as you get one vote more than the other candidate, you take all the electoral votes. Now, what happened in the 2016 election between Trump and Clinton was that Clinton took a number of the big states, such as California and as New York, and she took them by large majorities. And what happens here is that the Electoral College has a negative effect in states with large populations like that. So let's say, for argument's sake, that in California there were 10 million voters registered to vote. In order to win the electoral votes from California, all you needed was 5,000,001. The other 4,999,999 votes are actually irrelevant at that point, because as soon as somebody gets 5,000,001, they take all of California's electoral votes, which I don't quote me on this, but I believe they're above 37 votes just from that state. It's the most populous state that has the most electoral votes. It could actually be higher at this point. I will try and check that number and have it for you in the future. But the reality is, if somebody like Hillary Clinton carries California and gets 9 million votes, 4 million of those votes, or 399,999 of them, have no impact on the election because she already won the electoral votes in that state with the first 5 million votes. On the other hand, we had a situation where Donald Trump, particularly in the Midwest, went through a number of states that were not particularly large but had decent amounts of electoral votes, 6, 7, 10, 11, 12. And he managed to squeak by in each of those states by the slimmest of majorities. So he's going around barely winning in these states, but winning and getting all of their electoral votes. Those votes are all smaller. Those states are all smaller than California, have far fewer voters in California. Half the number of their voters is certainly far fewer than the number of voters in California or in New York. So when all the dust settled, Donald Trump had won the electoral votes from a huge number of smaller states and a couple of big states like Texas and Florida. But Hillary had taken a tremendous number of votes in California and in New York, which put her ahead in the popular vote. But again, once she had gotten the 51% or the 50%, 50.0001% of the votes in those states, every other vote that was cast under the Electoral College system, every other popular vote, becomes superfluous because she's already gotten whatever she can get from California or New York. And what she really needed to do, which apparently they did not do that great a job on, looking back in retrospect, was she really needed to have focused a lot more on a large number of smaller states to make sure that she was going to eke out 51% to grab the electoral votes in those states. It is a system that is very interesting. very convoluted in a lot of ways. As I said, many people have very great difficulty understanding it. If you watch the election night news coverage, a lot of the news reporters have difficulty understanding it. But it is a reality. And it is a system that we have operated under for 240 years at this point. It is the law. And until legal steps are taken, until amendment of the Constitution is done, it will remain the law. I fear what's coming up in the next few weeks because my suspicions are that a very similar thing could happen again, where Biden takes the majority of popular votes. However, the Trump people manage to get electoral votes in enough significant states that they win the election. And based on the unrest and civil disturbances that have gone on in the past 4 or 5 months, I am very fearful that more of the same will continue as the election rolls on. I'm also very fearful that the election is going to be contested in a number of ways, probably by both sides. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the various types of voting and voter suppression and some of those other things. Once the electors are chosen, they do not go to Washington to vote. What they do is they assemble at the state capital of each of their states on a date set in December by Congress, and on that date, they cast their votes for president. Their votes are then conveyed to Congress. Congress will open the votes and will determine who becomes president and vice president. Now, very interestingly, when the country was first established and the Constitution first written, the way the system worked was whoever got the majority of votes became president, whoever came in second became vice president. Well, the party system came into being very early in our country, and right away that created harrowing situations where you had a president from one party, a vice president from another party, and all the two of them did for their 4 years was fight and argue over what was happening, what was going on, who controlled what. So very early on, I believe before 1812, they had amended the system so that it works the way it does now, where people basically run as a ticket. So that within the states, each party puts up a president and vice president who run together. And then when it gets to the electoral college now, there are actually two separate votes. There's one for president, and whoever gets the majority of votes wins. There's one for vice president. Whoever gets the majority of that wins. Theoretically, you could have two different parties, but the way that the electors are chosen now, it's basically if the Democratic Party wins the election in California, the electors are all vowed to vote for the president and vice president that was picked by the people. That would be the Democrats. They would be violating the state rules and the state laws by picking a Republican for vice president in that case. So effectively, it works out that even though we have a separate vote for president, a separate vote for vice president, two people from the same party always win, always come up with the majority if there are the majority electoral votes coming in for that party. There has been talk of, and back during the 2016, because Trump was so bitterly disliked, there were a number of electors who between November and December, when they had to cast their votes, actually got on TV and got on the news and started talking about, well, nobody says who I have to vote for, and I could just go in and I won't vote for Trump. I will vote for somebody else, or I'll vote for the Democrat. I'll vote for Clinton. There are actually a couple people who did that. The reality is almost all states have laws that say that electors have to follow whatever procedures and rules have been set out by the state. And again, in most states, that means whoever gets a 51% majority, or whoever has the highest total number of popular votes, the electors must vote for that person. And if the electors fail to do that, many of the states impose penalties on them, fines or other types of penalties. The Constitution, believe it or not, is, even today, even after it's been amended a number of times, is absolutely silent on this issue. The federal courts never really had much to say about this, except, believe it or not, a month ago in July, came down with a couple of decisions based on the 2016 election. And in one of them, I believe it was from Washington State, an elector voted opposite what the rules said how his vote should be cast, and Washington law provides for the elector to be fined $1,000 if they do that, and the Supreme Court upheld that fine. They had the elector had hired some attorneys, or the party that had backed that elector to do this hired some attorneys and fought this all the way to the Supreme Court. And even more critically important, the state of Colorado had a statute that said if an elector indicates or tries to vote for somebody in violation of the rules, the Secretary of State has the power to immediately remove that elector and put in another person who will vote according to the way the popular vote had turned out. Now remember, again, this is not controlled by the Constitution or the federal courts, because the main body of the Constitution says it is up to the states to determine what procedures they will have in place to choose their electors to send to vote for the president. If the electoral votes get to Congress and no one gets 270, nobody becomes a clear winner, then the Congress must come into session. By state, they must cast votes, so each state at this point gets one vote. They can only vote for the top 3 candidates that came in for either president or vice president, and among them, whoever gets, again, 51%, would be 26 states voting for them, will become the president. So in the case of an electoral college failure to arrive at the right number or a tie, the Congress, voting state by state, gets to choose the president. Each state can only get one vote, which creates a number of problems for the states where they have divided Republican and Democratic sympathies, and a number of people in the Congress are from both parties. They somehow have to come together and work out a way to come up with one vote to present at this election. If no president is chosen by that method, then we are in uncharted territory. It's really unclear what happens after that. Now, the Constitution allowed the Congress to deal with presidential succession, and we will talk about that a little bit in the next week, in week 4, and to allow by statute to create an order of presidential succession once we get past the vice president. The 25th Amendment has come into play to somewhat modify that, but still basically left Congress in control. And at the moment, the next person in line of succession is the Speaker of the House, who presently is Nancy Pelosi. One of the things, if you've been reading any of the commentaries in the news, you've been following any of the chatting heads on TV, you'll know that one of the concerns that we're coming up with is that if the voting is thrown into chaos by way of mail-in votings and absentee ballots and other challenges to the system, will we even know who are supposed to be the electors by January 20th when the president's supposed to be sworn in? Will we even have a chance to send people to Congress? And again, the framers of the Constitution and the people who have worked on amendments since then never contemplated this happening. And certainly in the modern era, since the end of World War II, with the advent of telephone and radio and television, with voting machines and now computer voting, people have gotten very used to the idea that, we vote, and by the polls close by midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning Eastern time, and that within a couple of hours at the most, and certainly by the next morning, we'll know who the president's going to be. That may not happen every time. It may not happen this time. And so the issue becomes, if we get to January 20th, and they're still trying to figure out who had what votes, it's still challenging votes in the courts, it's still going crazy over this type of stuff, what will happen? Who becomes president? It seems to be, although it's not specifically spelled out this way, it seems it would be Nancy Pelosi, and if she is still Speaker of the House. But that gets us into another issue, because if the voting is really that crazily messed up, what happens if we don't know who won in Nancy Pelosi's district for the House of Representatives? In order for her to be her term as Speaker of the House actually ends on January 2nd of 2021, and either she gets sworn in for a new term or whoever beat her in the election gets sworn in for a new term. If we can't tell how the vote went for her particular seat in the House by that point in time, or if she is voted out, there is no Speaker of the House at that point in time. So it leaves us with an interesting conundrum at who would then be the president? What would happen? When we had the election in 2020, and what basically happened there was issues with the voting in Florida, and it got appealed, and it kept going on and on and on. And we actually got to December 12th, right before the time when the electors were supposed to cast their vote, and we still didn't know how Florida's race had gone. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court finally ruled that a ratification of the voting that had been made a week or so earlier by the Secretary of State was the last official word, and at that moment in time, Bush was ahead, so they basically said the Secretary of State of Florida ratified Bush at that point. Bush is the winner. But those of us who are history wonks and junkies and lawyers and law professors, we were all watching that with kind of bated breath, because for the first time in our history, it looked like we might get to January 20th and still not know who the president was supposed to be. Now, Bill Clinton at that point was somewhat quiet and reserved during this period, but he did make a couple of comments about he would happily stay on afterwards just to keep things under control and moving. The Constitution is absolutely silent on this, and again, it does give Congress the power to name the order of succession after president and vice president. It does say it would be the Speaker of the House, but we have to also know who won the district from whoever had been the Speaker of the House to see if they're going to be reelected, and we have to look and see if their party still controls the Congress. If these things are still under argument come January 20th, all bets are off. So get your pretzels, popcorn, and beer, or whatever your pleasure is, and get ready. There may be some very long nights and days and weeks of watching the news, trying to figure out what's going on here. All right. What do I want to talk about next here? Since 2016, since the great displeasure with the fact among many people that that Trump became president, even though Hillary clearly won the popular vote, a number of states have gotten together and they have created something called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. This is an agreement put in place by each state legislature where the state agrees to give its electoral college votes to whoever wins the most popular votes in the nationwide election. So in effect, instead of just looking at the votes individually state by state, the states would look at who won the most popular votes overall as a total, and by law would say that the electors of that state have to cast their votes for that person. Now, on first appearances, it would appear like, well, that's a good idea. That will take care of the issue. And therefore, forever after, whoever wins the popular vote will also get the electoral vote. Couple of kinks in the works here. Number one, they put into the ratifying legislation for this that it would only come into effect when the number of states that collectively control 270 electoral votes have put it into place. And that has not happened yet. 15 states and the District of Columbia have voted in favor of it. But taken all together, Rhode Island is one of the states that voted for this. Taken all together, these states do not have 270 electoral votes, so this compact is not in place for the upcoming election in 5 weeks now. Beyond that, this sounds like a very wonderful and ideal system, and this will be a really great thing, but it ignores the fact that state legislatures are chosen by their local people over local issues usually, and they are very much beholden to what's going on with the popular vote, with the actual on-the-ground voters in their particular state. I can envision a period in time when states like California and New York may have large numbers of people, vast majority of people voting for one person for president, one candidate for president, and then you have a whole number of other smaller states where the favorite in California and New York loses by a dramatic number of votes. And so you could come up with the peculiar situation where in Iowa, one person only got 10% of the vote, the other candidate for president got 90% of the vote, but in California the roles were reversed. And if Iowa had been part of this compact, it would mean that Iowa's electoral votes would have to go to the person who had only gotten 10% of the vote in Iowa because they had won in California and New York. I pictured this happening once, and once that it happens, people in various states rising up and saying, that's it, you voted us in, vote us out of this compact. If we're going to lose to some other party, we don't want to be complicit in it, particularly in a situation where the majority of people in our state have made it very clear who they're voting for, but other states have a different point of view. We're not just going to throw our electors to whoever California, New York, or Florida decide they want to have as president. So, as with all things in life, Murphy's Law of Unintended Consequences comes into play. While the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact sounds like a rational solution that would get us to where we would have the electoral vote and the popular vote align with each other without having to go through the tortuous process of amending the Constitution, it has some of its own internal flaws and internal consequences that the public and the population as a whole may not really like once they get to realize what they are. All right. I am going to actually stop here because this finishes the first half of this section, and I will pick up again with a part 2 of this video. So I will see you back shortly in a bit.